All right, so your machine's been on your job site, it's been operating well, and then, there may be some common issues that do occur. Say, for example, the vacuum's not sucking like it used to. The engine is bogging down, or you ran it out of fuel and you can't get it back started. We're going to go through a couple of things to help troubleshoot these items and then also get you back up and running in the field as well. Say the machine was running the day before just fine, it was pulling just fine, and then the next morning it's not running as it should, or it progressively stops sucking as good as it should. One thing we're certainly going to check is your vacuum gauge here. So this tells you how much vacuum the machine is going to be pulling. Right now the machine is off, so it's at 0, but when it's fully deadheaded at the inlet, it's going to pull between 25 and 28 inches on this vacuum gauge. That's completely deadheaded. So what you want to ensure that is you have adequate vacuum when you're putting on a hose and things like that. And running it, you'll see how this gauge significantly goes up, 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 and then when you start pulling abrasive, it'll continue to go up. Well, for diagnostic purposes, what you always want to do is you want to disconnect your hopper hose here from where you hooked up your vacuum hose. You want to disconnect this hose here. Then you want to get a piece of plywood or a board or something similar that can cover that opening. Then you want to, while it's in the vacuum cycle, you want to deadhead it using a board. And what you're looking for is you want to see how high of a vacuum this gauge is going to pull. And it should pull above 25, above 25. If it's like at 22 or 23, it's still maybe fine, but generally it's going to be between 20 and 25. So if you see it where it's only pulling like 10, 15 and not reaching 20, that's a good indicator that your filters are needed for service or due for service. So in that case, please reach out to your sales rep or your account manager and we'll schedule the service for you. Say your machine you shut it down for the night and then you're going into starting the next morning and it won't rev up and it won't go into a vacuum cycle. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be your remote e-stop here. A lot of times what happens is, either the button's pushed in or stayed in, or if it rained that night before and they left it on the ground, it could have filled it up with water and messed up the switch that's inside of there. So the first thing you always want to check is your e-stop. Make sure it's pulled out, make sure it's functioning, and make sure it's, most importantly, plugged in. If you incidentally ran your machine out of fuel and it's having a hard time starting, this is the steps we're going to take to get that up and running. So a diesel engine, it cannot have any air bubbles within the fuel system. If it does, it's not going to open the injectors, and in that case, it's not going to inject the fuel into the engine to get it to fire up. So first thing we always want to do is just make sure that the machine is topped off with fuel again. So we'll go over to the gauge here. We're going to make sure the machine's full. If not, let's go fill the fuel tank up right here. And at least put a quarter of a tank. If not, just fill it up all the way. That way you can keep the machine running once you do get it started. Secondly, we're going to go over here to the front of the engine. So on every diesel engine, there's a primer pump, or some people call it a thumb pump, or what, there's different terminologies for it, but essentially it's what's used to fill the fuel filters without having to take the fuel filters off. So on this machine, it has a primer pump or a thumb pump, which is located behind the fuel filters. There's a fuel filter here, and there's a fuel filter here. So there's 2 fuel filters on this machine. There's one that filters the fuel as it goes through the primary filter, and then once it goes from this filter, it goes to a secondary filter, then goes to your injection pump and then to your injectors. The one we want to prime, or at least focus on priming, is the second one. So on the top of this fuel filter, you'll see this plastic screw right here. So what you're going to do is you're going to loosen that screw up. You don't want to take it all the way out, but you want it to be very loose. Then you're going to get your thumb pump, which is located behind the wiring harness here. And then you're going to pump that thumb pump until you see fuel squirting out of the screw. What that's going to do is that's going to refill the filters with fuel, and they get those fuel lines primed up again. Once you get adequate fuel squirting out of it, where there's no air pockets or anything coming out, just solid streams of fuel, you're going to tighten that screw up, and then you're going to try to crank it over again. If for some reason it doesn't crank over, and it cranks but it doesn't fire up, that means you have more air in your fuel system. So we're going to have to continue to bleed that air out. So we're going to repeat this step of repriming the fuel filters here in the fuel system. Then we're going to go on the back of the machine to where we're going to see the fuel injection pump. So the fuel injection pump is located right behind here. And what that does is that's what actually pulls the fuel from the fuel tank and then injects it into the injectors. So you're going to find the fuel injection pump. You're going to see hard lines that come off the injection pump that go to the top of the engine. So what you're going to do is once you trace those lines to where it goes into the top of the engine, you want to get an appropriate wrench, starting from left to right, loosen the nut that's on there that holds that injection line on, and then have somebody crank it until fuel starts squirting out of that line. Once you see fuel, you want to tighten it up, and then you want stop cranking. You want to tighten up your injector line, then move on to cylinder number 2 and 3 and 4, and rinse and repeat that process. Generally, once you get to 3 of them, the engine will fire itself up. It'll be a little hiccupy or sputtery initially, but it will push those air bubbles out of the injectors, and it should run smoothly going forward. So that's how you utilize the Hurricane 500 from MES from start to finish. Thank you for watching, and if you ever need anything, please reach out.